Hi, everybody. This is Jeff Saltzman from OrgVitality. And just having a little bit of a technical glitch this morning, but I think we've got it, a workaround for it. So I think we're ready to start. Thank you all for joining us. Welcome to our second virtual conference. Everybody should be able to see my screen now. And if that's not the case, please enter a comment into the chat box and we'll figure out what's going on. But everybody should be able to see my screen now. So welcome to our second virtual conference. Our first one was in the spring, and we were thrilled that about 600 people chose to attend last spring. The numbers are still out for this conference, but it looks like we're going to have about 500 attendees across the 2 days of the conference. We're pleased to have you join us for one or more of these complimentary sessions over the next 2 days. We have a great lineup, and let me tell you what the various presentations are. It's not too late to register, by the way, for any of these. So if you want to attend, if any of these look interesting, just go to orgvitality.com. And at the top of the screen, there's a place to say, look at the conference, and you can pick whichever sessions you'd like to. Just one word of logistics for that. If you register for one session, it doesn't mean you registered for all of them. You have to register for each one of these separately. But it's not too late, so let me quickly review what these various sessions are. Right after this introduction, I'll be starting about managing people in 2021 and beyond. At 11:45, despite many good intentions, D&I programs don't actually deliver any impact. Omri Johnson, who's the former global head of diversity and inclusion at Novartis, is going to share concrete ways to ensure that your internal D&I programs are meaningful. It should be a really interesting session there. At 1 o'clock this afternoon in Eastern time, stress levels are up, and Dr. Walter Reichman and Dr. Vicki Alcott will discuss how to build and sustain an effective mental health program in an organization to help deal with the stress and the situation that we now find ourselves in. At 2 o'clock this afternoon, Jerry Siebert will review the data that we've collected. At the start of the pandemic, OrgVitality offered a free well-being and business resilience survey. And Jerry's going to present the key findings from these 60, 70,000 people who completed that survey. And we'll explore what leadership should be thinking about and doing with the results. At 2:45 this afternoon, we have lessons for COVID leadership. Dr. Joel Moses, who's a true pioneer in the world of executive assessment and coaching, is going to focus on new kinds of leadership behaviors that are emerging during and after this COVID crisis, and how best to apply these. Joel Moses is a longtime worker in the area of executive assessment. I remember reading his research when I was in graduate school. So it's a real thrill to be able to have him here at our conference. Delivering feedback that inspires and motivates your remote team begins at 3:30. Dr. Susie Kamen will discuss how to create a feedback-rich environment. What the heck are your employees thinking these days and why you need to care at 4:30 today. Dr. Scott Brooks will explain how leadership credibility and employee confidence are tied to organizational success and discuss ways that companies can boost or maintain effectiveness. Then we're getting on to tomorrow. We start at 11 o'clock, re-onboarding a pandemic workforce. Dr. Victoria Hendrickson discusses the key issues to consider when designing and administering pulse surveys and bringing employees back on site. At noon tomorrow, an agile performance management upgrade. This was an employee-led hack at PepsiCo. Dr. Scott Brooks will chat with Sachin Jain and Kira Barden, both from PepsiCo, to see how they implemented a crowdsourced feedback program and used the results of it to shape the company's future performance management strategy. How to build an anti-racist organization begins at 1 o'clock tomorrow. Again, Dr. Victoria Hendrickson, along with Sir Therese Grice, will discuss how to measure employee feedback around racial issues, as well as how to better support minority employees in the workplace. At 2 o'clock tomorrow, listening during times of crisis, Medtronic will be represented. Dr. Chris Lovato, Nicole Herc, both of Medtronic, will jointly present on the importance of employee listening, and during and after the pandemic crisis, how Medtronic maintained a focus and commitment to learn from their employees through the use of data analytics. And the last session is tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Join Dr. Scott Brooks as he chats with experts to see how they've adapted their survey programs and executive messaging for the current environment we're all finding ourselves in. And one final item that didn't make this list, after the last session at 4 o'clock, we'd like to invite everyone to a virtual happy hour where you come off mute, go on video if you like for an informal chat with our panelists. To sign up, go to the website, register for the last session at 3 to 4, because the happy hour will just continue in that workspace. So register for that session from 3 to 4. If you don't want to go to that session, that's fine, just sign on at 4 o'clock. But the happy hour will begin at 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. So lots of sessions, 12 sessions, 7 today, 5 tomorrow. They're all looking very, very good to me, and I hope they look interesting, and you can find at least 1 or 2 sessions that you'd like to attend over the next couple of days. Let's begin with managing people in 2021 and beyond. And as I mentioned, I'm Jeff Saltzman, the CEO of OrgVitality, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this OV webinar, the first in the conference, Managing People in 2021 and Beyond. We'll be sending you a copy of the slides over the next few days, so don't worry about having to take notes. If you want to ask a question, there are 2 places on the Zoom panel where you can do that. If you put your question into the chat box, everybody will see it. If you put it into the Q&A panel, it can be directed just to the panelists. If we run out of time and there's anything in here you want to talk about, I'm happy to correspond with you via email. So however it works for you. So 2020 has been quite a year, right? It's been a tough year, which has brought all different kinds of problems that we've had to deal with. And as we look to 2021, we have to ask what could possibly go wrong. Just thinking about it can feel overwhelming. Which threats do you attempt to mitigate for yourself, your family, for loved ones, your organization, or your country even? How do you manage people who are also thinking about these issues, some handling it better than others? But the number of issues we're facing, potentially in the end here of 2020 and on to 2021, just enormous, and can be quite overwhelming. What could happen, right? So as we look at 2021, all those possibilities weigh on people and affect them both in their personal life and work life, including increased stress and anxiety, increased uncertainty about what to do, what actions to take. There's been an uptick in mental health issues, both in society and in the workplace, and a corresponding increase in physical ailments. For the organization, this can result in lower productivity, absenteeism, lower work performance, lower service levels to customers, lower customer satisfaction, and ultimately lower profits. So how do you manage through this potential minefield? So in order to take a step back and say, what advice can we offer? Based on years of research, a number of years ago, Scott Brooks and I developed what we call a vitality model. And it utilizes an organization, an organization can make better able to weather the storm and survive for the long term by paying attention to some critical areas. So there's a balance that needs to be struck between the here and now and the long term. And without that focus on the here and now, you never get to the long term. And without the long term, your organization is going to wither over time. So there's a balance, if you will. We depict it by a wheel with an internal and external surface. But the internal is the here and now, the external is looking toward the future. But the areas of focus, three of them are internal. And what we have on the internal are employees. So what do we need to do with employees today? And what do we need to do to prepare them for the future? Things like selection, development, enablement. There's leadership. Leadership today, do you have the right butts in the right seats? It's just very basic stuff. Also, how do you envision the future? How do you take the organization into that future? Processes, internal processes, how the work gets done efficiently and effectively, and tightening up those processes in time and turmoil pays great dividends. And then there's some external areas of focus, and these are customers, for instance, market segments. Do you need to pursue additional market segments or different market segments in this time of COVID? Awareness of the customers of your products, a willingness to refer your customers, willing to refer you to others. Service, how you interact with customers, the organization, customer interface, and of course your offerings, the products and services that you are offering customers. And as you think about these 6 areas, again, 3 internal, 3 external, what I'm going to be focusing on today is really just the employee piece of this, right? So with everything that's going on, how do you deal with what the employees are going through? What does the organization have to do? If you're interested in more on this topic, by the way, this is based on a book that Scott and I wrote in 2016 called Creating the Vital Organization. So let's look first at the typical characteristics of employees who are better able to cope with the stresses of the environment that we're in. The first characteristic is really openness, if you will. So openness is, we're going to define it as a willingness to seek new and original ideas, possibilities, or situations. Other people have done lots of research on this term of openness. One I particularly like is Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist out of New York, NYU. He developed a scale on openness called neophobic or neophilic. So neophobic are people who are afraid of new situations. Neophilic are people who absolutely love new, exciting, different things. And of course, nobody's at one extreme or the other. This is a scale, a sliding scale, and most of us are somewhere in the middle. But what he finds, and what the research seems to show, is that people who tend to be open to new, different ways of behaving, new situations, are able to deal with the trauma that we're facing today a little more effectively. The second characteristic is optimism. A positive attitude in regards to challenges and possibilities. This is how we're going to define optimism. These individuals are confident in their abilities and embrace obstacles as learning opportunities. So they don't look at the challenges we're facing really as, oh my God, how are we going to get beyond this? But rather they say, this is a chance for me to learn something new, whether it's a new skill or a new way of operating. So employees who come to these tasks with a higher level of optimism seem to be able to better deal with this situation. Third characteristic is resiliency. And this is the ability to learn from failures and bounce back from conflict or adversity. If you want a reference on this, Carol Dweck does some interesting work on resiliency, and she has a book out called Grit, which is a really interesting read. The next attribute is agility. So the ability to adapt to new environments, shift priorities, and work based on new information or obstacles. So being able to switch directions quickly. A problem solver is someone who is able to integrate solid information from multiple sources to solve complex problems. Extroversion, someone who can bring teams together, take a leadership role, and act sociably in these situations. A personal orientation is someone who is aware of oneself and how they affect others. And finally, career orientation. This is someone who's focused on improving their own innate abilities as a way to self-develop and enhance their future prospects in terms of jobs, positions, etc. So these are characteristics of employees who tend to be better able to cope in a dynamic world where you must focus on the here and now as well as the future. And certainly we need to focus on the here and now to deal with the current situation, but we also need to say, where are we going in the future? So there's very good news about all these characteristics. And the good news is that while a certain level of these characteristics are innate, right, and part of personality, many of these characteristics can be enhanced through training and experiences. One book that I'm in the middle of reading, and I just wanted to mention, is Doris Kearns Goodwin, a noted historian, wrote a book called Leadership in Turbulent Times. And she discusses how Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, and Lyndon Johnson overcame adversity and challenges, and they learned to remake themselves into great leaders. They were not necessarily born great leaders. They learned through their experiences, through developing themselves, how to become great leaders. So this is a book I highly recommend in terms of how do you help people deal with the current situation and prepare themselves for what comes next. So how should the organization treat employees to bring out their best characteristics in today's situation? What's changed? What's remained the same? Let's look at some fundamentals here. So I want to define two concepts here. Yeah, one of the biggest debates I've gotten into in the last 30 years centers on what employees want out of a job. Has it changed? Does it vary by culture, by age? As though the fundamental psychology of humans can shift over the course of a generation, a span of about 20 years. You know, what employees want out of a job can be thought of as the fundamentals, right? Which are unchanging, and the expression of the fundamentals are based on the current environment. For instance, can you find for me any worker anywhere on this planet who doesn't want to be treated with respect and dignity? Is there any generation that doesn't care deeply about being treated respectfully? Who would not be deeply concerned, for instance, about being laid off and not being able to find another job except one at much lower pay? And who, find me someone who's uninterested in having competent leadership, who wants to follow a jerk into battle? The fundamentals are the timeless expectations on the part of the employee for what the compact between the organization and the person should be. The expression of those fundamentals, how they're delivered upon, is what changes by geography, by generation, by age, etc. So how those fundamentals are executed upon, based on economic situation, unemployment levels, skill sets, etc., will in fact shift. And that's what I found in terms of studying people in the workplace for about 35 years now. So for instance, job security was less of a concern, right, a number of years ago, until there were no jobs to be had. Then job security becomes a concern once again. So some of the fundamentals that I'm talking about here, first is respect and dignity, right? Second is equity, right? That for what I put into the organization, I get a fair exchange. The third is understanding and message, which is, do I understand the purpose of this organization? What are we doing? What do we stand for? How do I fit in to this? So giving people that sort of basic understanding of what the whole organization is about. Performance enablement. One of the biggest dissatisfactions I've seen in organizations over the years are when people are frustrated in terms of being able to get their jobs done. People want to do a good job at work. They come to work expecting to do a good job, and then the organization oftentimes gets in the way of them being able to do a good job, and that is one of the biggest dissatisfiers out there. So performance enablement, giving people what they need to actually execute on the task that you're asking them to do. The next one is achievement. People want to feel like they've actually accomplished something, that they're not just spinning their wheels day to day in the job. And most importantly, or very importantly, I should say, people want a sense of future. They want a sense of what is in this for the long term. where we're going, and how do I fit in. I know a person who did his dissertation on change in organizations, and he found, three very important factors were important to people as they looked at change in organization. The first factor was what's in it for me, how do I fit in? The second factor was what's in it for me, how do I fit in? And the third factor was what's in it for me, how do I fit in? So giving people a sense of that future, where they fit in the organization and where it's going, is absolutely critical. So these are just some of the fundamentals, things that do not change over time, things that do not change by generations, things that do not change by where in the world we happen to be. The expression of those fundamentals will in fact change, right? So the question is not, is respect and dignity now not important because of the COVID environment or the social unrest that we're finding ourselves in. The question is, how do you define respect and dignity in this current environment? Not that it's unimportant, but how do you deliver on it? So for instance, in terms of equity, it used to be just pay and benefits, right? That was how you hit that equity equation. But now it may also be like giving people the ability to volunteer for social causes in the workplace, right? So that may not have been important to the workers or as important to the workers in the 1950s and 60s, but it may be very important now. So how you reach that sense of equity will in fact change over time, but achieving that equity position for people is what is unchanging. Okay, so here's an example. The children today, now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for their elders. They love chatter in place of exercise. Children are now tyrants, not the servants of their household. They no longer rise when elders enter the room. They contradict their parents, chatter before company, gobble up dainties at the table, cross their legs, and tyrannize their teachers, right? So does this describe your child's kindergarten friends? You may think so, although some of the words sort of give it away, but it's actually much older. This is how Socrates described the troublesome younger generations. It's the patterns that you hear about the younger generation being different or wanting something different out of the work environment. It's a complaint that each generation makes about the one that came before. It almost seems like it's an evolutionary adaptation to make separation when the younger generation leaves home somewhat easier. So in today's current environment, what we're facing is increased stress and anxiety, increased uncertainty, health concerns, economic concerns, childcare concerns, political concerns, and for some, a sense of isolation or loneliness. So for instance, the stress and anxiety levels that we saw before COVID were high. Now, as we measure it on employee surveys, I've never seen it as high as it is today. It wouldn't be shocking, for instance, to see 80+% of the employees in a population say they're experiencing levels of stress that it interferes with their ability to get their work done. Not that they're just stressed, but the level of stress is such that it actually is interfering with their ability to get their work done, right? So the levels of stress we're seeing in the environment are just off the charts. Loneliness is an interesting one as well. Loneliness is, the term itself hasn't existed forever. The term was first used in British literature at the end of the 16th century to define the condition of being solitary. In 1677, Milton in Paradise Lost featured one of the first lonely characteristics lonely characters who happened to be Satan. And he described Satan and his loneliness in terms of being vulnerable. It's an interesting metaphor for today's environment. Even though we're tied in electronically, there's a certain loneliness of being away from other people where you're physically together. And that loneliness in the literature sometimes is defined as vulnerability. Seems apropos. So, coping with the current environment, how do you cope with all of this? In uncertain, what are people looking for? In uncertain and fear-inducing situations, people want effective, trustworthy, decisive leadership, which points to a solution path, right? Their desire for information is insatiable, right? As information can reduce uncertainty, open, honest, trustworthy communication are critical, as is giving information that's useful in reducing uncertainty. Employees want to hear the truth, and they want to hear it from the top of the house, the CEO being the preferred source when you're talking about where's the company as a whole going. What you want to do is get people involved in solving problems, give them as much control as possible over their lives. That's the when people feel like they have a control, when they have a sense of being able to solve the problems and implement those solutions, it gives them a sense of control of their lives, which is important in this particular environment. Articulate a clear sense of purpose of what the organization is doing to cope with the environment, and provide assurance where you can. A couple of to-dos. So, if you wanted to say, how do I take this and implement in my organization things that would actually impact these factors? Make sure leadership is visible and not hidden away in planning sessions. Work towards creating a high trust environment. Communicate often, fully, and honestly, utilizing multiple channels. You cannot over-communicate right now. Ensure communication is two-way. Listen as well as talk. Make sure managers up and down the line are asking and listening. Ask people regularly, how are you doing? Or as Andrew Cuomo would say, no, wait a minute, how are you really doing, right? Don't give me, how you doing, fine. No, stop. Tell me how you're really doing. How do you really feel? How are you coping? Make sure people have what they need to work as effectively as possible. But you also have to realize they may be facing stresses and strains of which you're completely unaware. You need to make sure people feel safe while working, whether that's PPE, whether that's social distancing, whatever it might be, you have to make people feel safe. Implement solutions that the staff themselves have developed if possible. Articulate a clear sense of purpose and what the organization is doing to cope. Provide assurance on the company and personal future where you can. And I'd like to make one final point here as I wrap up, and that is people are very positive when forward momentum is felt, right? When we measure employee satisfaction, we find that the most satisfied are often from locations that are showing positive shifts in organizational performance rather than absolute high levels of organization performance. In other words, people are very positive when forward momentum is felt. This holds true not only in the work environment, but in many aspects of people's lives. It has a very powerful influence on the attitudes and on a sense of well-being. So thanks for this quick run through of what to do in terms of coping and how to manage people through this kind of environment. If we're out of time, but if you'd like to send me any questions, I'm Jeffrey Saltzman at OrgVitality.com. Feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to engage in a discussion with you. Thanks for your time, everybody. Goodbye.